unbelievable good product, tough product, strong root system, excellent emergence out of the ground.
Good morning. John McNamara with the Wilbur-Ellis Plattsmouth location, coming to you with our second edition of our virtual plot tour. As we spoke about this morning, and before I should say, this is basically a reality tour that we'll do periodically throughout the summer, and we'll talk about current agronomic events, we'll showcase some genetics along the way, and kind of give you an outlook of what we're seeing in the field. So we're going to start this morning, kind of like we did last time. We're going to look at a few of our trials, a couple of things that we've bumped into here in the last week to 10 days, things that are similar in your fields, and then we'll also talk about some of the genetics here. So we're in our starter and our no starter break. So if you can kind of look down the row, you can see a sizable difference still, even when corn is this big. So why is that important when corn is this big? Well, when we start digging at some of the treatments out here, you can kind of see where the corn is at from a developmental standpoint. You can kind of start staging the corn like we did last time when we talked about collars. So here's your first true collar. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We're about at V8. Now, currently we've accumulated probably about 950 or so heat units. So when we talk about that stage of development, which we did last time, this will be a little bit further down the line. We talk about where the growing point is, and it's right here. So it's well above the soil line. Root development, seminal roots have fully developed. As I slice the tassel out, you can see that as far as where it's coming from, way down within. And when you get to this point, you start using a fair amount of nutrition. So the paradigm has shifted here in the last few years, where 200 bushel dryland corn has quickly become the norm. When we talk about sulfur and zinc and manganese and boron, those are not usually nutritional elements that we talk about in some of our standard blends, some of our complete blends, the 624-6s or the 1034-Os. So one of the easier ways to get those additional elements is to look at a starter trial. Now, if you want to just talk about height differences, and here again, this is all a beauty contest until you get it in the bin. When we talk about plant height of the non-starter, right to the top of the whorl is about 18 inches. When we talk about the plant height of the corn of the to the top of the whorl, it's got about a 2-inch gap. It's almost 20. It will even out in time as this corn continues to root. But from a standpoint of establishment, getting your crop off to a good start, and accessing those additional elements that improves your yield goal, the starter fertilizer has a tendency to do that year in, year out. Part of our plot tours every year is to look at some of the genetics that DeKalb and Asgrow has to offer. And this year is no different. As we've talked about before, the Mynard location is one of 5 that the Plattsmouth branch has this year. They're all set up the same. They all go from their early maturity to the full season in the same orientation. The difference between all of them is the management style. What we try to include every year is some of the newer genetics, or the brand new releases from DeKalb. So you can see DKC 6080 right in the middle, and that's a new 110-day corn. It's right between DKC 5982 and DKC 6088. Remember, 5982 was a brand new hybrid with DeKalb last year, did quite well last fall. 6088's been an old standard in 110. So now we're bringing 6080, and you might be thinking, well, what does it have to offer more than what we can find with 5982 and 6088? 5982 is a nice, tough soil, put it anywhere type hybrid. 6088 has a tendency to work on some of your better fertility, higher production acres. Where do we think 6080 is going to fit? Well, If you look at some of the testing that we have out of the breeders, 60-80 is showing about a 3 bushel advantage in this same maturity, given the like comparisons within DeKalb. Top end yields there, good plant health when we're looking at both moderate to yield environment. So it's kind of giving you a little bit more of a yield punch than you might find with 5982. Good stalk and root strength, good green snap tolerance, which is always important this time of year. Overall disease package is very good. So we kind of think it's going to be a replacement a little bit. It's probably going to lean more toward that 60-88 acre. We will watch all of these throughout the summer. It looks like corn right now, that is true. However, we generally don't bring hybrids out into the current lineup unless they have a marked yield advantage over current items that we're selling. So we'll keep track of 60-88 we'll keep track of 60-80 throughout the summer and give you an update as far as what it looks like compared to some of the things that you're currently planting. We talked about mare's tail control in our last edition, and if you remember right, Jason Hansen, our summer intern, did kind of a time sequence from the time the dicamba was applied to the first 4 or 5 days after the application, and the amount of burn down you could expect on mare's tail. That it was essentially about knee high. It was about 18-20 inches tall when the application was made. Now we're out about 10 days after application, and you can see we generally did a pretty fair job in killing 95-97% of the mare's tail out here. However, you can see instances like this one, where the majority of the population has already died. However, this one that we worry about, will that come back? And the answer is probably yes. What we talk about with weed control, regardless of the mode of action, is kind of the source of application and then the sink, or how it's transported throughout the phloem of the plant, and how well of a job it does killing it. We're looking for brown or discolored meristematic tissue within the stem of the plant. And in this case, when you see white healthy tissue like this, it means that the plant's probably not going to die, at least from the herbicide aspect of things. But you also want to try to look at how far it was transported down the plant. And in this case, it really didn't do that much. Now, some will argue that, aha, that's already resistant. And I won't argue whether it is or it isn't. The only true way to know whether you have true glyphosate resistance is to run it through a lab, have them do a replicated study with multiple rates of application, and get some data behind that. An application miss or an escape like this is probably just a product of we didn't have enough rate on, or we didn't have enough carrier volume applied, or a combination of the two linked with the plant height at application. My guess is that plant has shrunk a little bit from the time of application. It might have been knee high. Now, dicamba was applied. Given all the soap opera, I call it, within the EPA and the courts on whether or not dicamba can be applied to Roundup Ready Xtend soybeans right now, dicamba is a very viable choice for killing mare's tail, Palmer amaranth, water hemp in season, especially if they have any height. However, given the application restrictions that we currently have, or that are being debated within the courts, you might interact and look at alternative things. We've talked about this a little bit already. Things like diphenyl ethers, the cobras, the blazers, the flex stars, they do a fine job too, but the key with those is that the mare's tail has to be small. Water hemp has to be small. What I talk about small is less than 6 inches tall in order for you to get any type of active success with it. So keep that in mind when you're looking at your post-emergent options, if in fact you're unable to use dicamba on this type of weed pressure. Here's a visual of what we've got going on with our soybean starter trial. So to the left, we have the untreated soybean of 37X8, and to the right, we have the treated soybean of 37X8, treated with Acceleron Custom Blend. Seed treatments have been debated in their value for a number of years. Our 12-year average now is that the treated soybean gives you somewhere in the neighborhood of 4.5 bushel yield advantage over the untreated. And like I've said before, it's all a beauty contest until you put it in the bin. However, active, vigorous growth, getting an early rooting system, we have no idea what's going to happen to the rest of this season. Has a tendency to believe that, yeah, it looks better, it's probably going to yield better. And as data helps support this statement, the seed treatments certainly are a value to it. I'm not going to get into which one is better. We use Acceleron with our Asgrow system because it works real well. The E007 as a drying agent prevents stickiness of the soybean, provides a nice uniform coat, allows fairly seamless flowability through planters to give you that little better stand. And you can kind of see not only do you have a trifoliate difference in development, but it also looks a little bit thicker in population. So for those of you that are entertaining low populations to begin with, and what do I talk about with low? I would talk about anything below 140,000 as seed drop. Seed treatments are a pretty solid investment for you at $13 a unit. And if we start doing the math, even on today's markets, we talk about $8 beans. We talk about averages of 4.5 bushel differences. So your gross is about $32 advantage per acre with the seed treatment. Minus the $13, it still seems to me that you're making a little bit of money with seed treatments. We'll keep an eye on this one throughout the summer, but just wanted to kind of give you an update on what we got going with seed treatments in soybeans. Now that we're into the teens of June, I think today's the 15th, we talk about soybeans getting close to having initial blooms. We look at this soybean planted as example. These were planted on the 21st of April. So here's your cotyledon node, here's your unifoliate nodes, and here's where you're at from a trifoliate stage. There's your first, second, third, fourth. Here's your fifth, and here's your fifth trifoliate, and there's your sixth one that are coming out. You'll also see some of these blooms that are starting to proliferate, which is not uncommon. Soybeans bloom on night length, and they usually start somewhere around the first day of summer, which is coming up here in the next week or two. Cotyledons are no longer being used as a source of energy for the plant. It's all a photosynthetic reaction now. Root system has developed about 6 inches deep. So this is our 5th year of looking at soybean population. We've done this similar to what we've done in years past, looking at 100,000, 125,000, 150,000, 175,000, and 200,000. So we've got quite a range looking at which one yields the most. There's been a lot of work from academics talking about ultra low populations. I am more reserved as far as what I think is ideal. You know, I would like to see you finish with about that 150,000 range, and what you from drop to what you finish with usually is a fairly drastic number when you look at it from a soybean standpoint. Not so much in corn, but soybeans have the innate ability to make up for lots of things, and population is one of them. So give you a quick look at what we got from a stand standpoint from populations. Here's what 100,000 in population and 15-inch rows look like. Here's 125,000, looks pretty good, but they're established and they're growing vigorously. Here's 150,000, and 125,000 almost looks better than the 150, but remember that you have more interplant competition here. It's probably going to retard at least initial growth. And here's 175,000. Now, the thing to remember is that as your population gets thicker, you're going to canopy these 15-inch rows a little bit faster, and you're going to let the crop act as a herbicide late season, whereas thinner stands have the ability to let that sunlight penetrate the canopy, and given growing conditions and the right amount of rainfall, have added weed pressure late season in August. Will it affect yield is the question. Is it just cosmetic because you want it to look better from the road? It's usually about, will it yield any different? And typically, yeah, you might accept some weeds in August. It's going to look rough through that canopy on thinner stands. However, yield really doesn't suffer all that much usually, unless you have an excessive density of taller weeds such as sunflower or a lot of Palmer amaranth or water hemp. It's really weed species dependent. Soil compaction at gateways is not uncommon. Most growers have some field where the traffic from last year's harvest, maybe it was some of the traffic from this year's planting, create scenarios like this. Now you can see where the post-emergent application tracks went in, and there's not a lot of corn growing. But you can sporadically see wide differences in plant height. At 8:30 in the morning, some of these compacted plants have already started to roll for the day. They're trying to conserve as much moisture. Whereas if you go to your left or your right, you can kind of see where, yeah, that corn looks like it ought to be. It's rooted, it's doing fine. So what I wanted to do is show you some of the differences between compacted and non-compacted. So if I can get the tile spade into the ground, I want to show you the differences in lateral root development. See how platy that soil is? It's in my shadow. It almost looks like a slab of concrete. And that's what happens with soil compaction. The pores within the soil get smashed down, and they kind of have a hard time breaking up. And that's kind of hard for a root system to break through. See this beginning of the seminal root? Yeah, pick that up. See how it's starting to go lateral. It's searching for as much moisture and nutrition as it possibly can find. So we keep digging, trying to get this thing out of the ground. There she comes. And you see basically how flat that root system is. Okay, it's unable to penetrate that soil profile. Normal corn will root somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 feet, but you kind of see that most of these roots are going laterally. If you have compaction, as long as it keeps raining, you'll be okay. But if it stops raining, which it kind of has around here lately, yeah, here's where the kernel was, barely a ½ inch deep. You get a root system that looks a lot like that. Now, let's look at a normal one. You can kind of see how the root system is going down. That's where we want it to go. That's where our nutrition is. That's where our water is. You can kind of see the ill effects of soil compaction. Well, how do you fix it? Well, there's been arguments over the years talking about deep tillage and fracturing that hard pan, and that's all very important. The more important issue there is to do it when it's right. Wet soil has a tendency, or wet soil in compacted areas, has a tendency to make that compacted area bigger. You're basically dragging and slabbing that soil and driving that existing hard pan even deeper when you do that. If you have fractured or the ability to fracture that soil because the water content within the soil profile is low enough, you can crumble it in your hands. It doesn't come out like glue. That's a good time to do that. Whether it's spring or fall, or maybe you have a warmer period within the winter to go ahead and do that. We have a tendency to do this right after harvest. While we're able to harvest it, let's get it ripped as deep as we can prior to the winter and let the freeze-thaw cycle fracture that soil. And that's also important. It helps a lot, but also try to do that tillage or deep tillage when the soil is dry enough. time of year we talk about emergence and stand counts and how well we did from planting the crop. This is a great example of some of the inconsistencies, not only in the drop of the plant, but also the ability of the plant to be competitive with each other. I call it wavy corn, corn that's normal height within a field, and then some that go way down in plant height. Some of this stuff, as an example, geez, it's barely 2 inches. So if you look at the amount of residue within that seed trench, there probably wasn't a lot moved, which would suggest that planter unit rose up and didn't get as deep as a planting depth as we'd like. So when we look at that, we can kind of figure out the depth of kernel. It's not a matter of moisture here, but you're looking for how deep that kernel was planted. And here's a really good example. So you see that layer of thatch underneath, right? And what I'm looking for is where that kernel depth is, where that kernel is planted. And you can kind of see that relic right there. See? There's your kernel depth. So we usually talk about 2 inches deep, and that might be about 1.5 inches. But you see this big thick layer of soybean residue from years past that's probably inhibited some of its initial growth. Now, when you have differences in plant height to this degree, is that going to impact yield? Even if we get beneficial rainfall and some of these smaller plants try to catch up as much as they can. Most of this corn in this field is looking like about the 6th collar. You've got some that are barely at 1 collar. Why is that important? Pollination is a big thing when we're talking about uneven corn. It normally takes corn about a week to 10 days to pollinate a whole field of corn. Corn in active growing weather like this will put a collar of active growth on about every 3rd to 4th day. So we talk about a 2 collar difference at pollination. If you have a greater than a 2 collar difference at pollination, the chances of those smaller plants developing a viable ear are very small. In some cases it might even turn into a weed from a standpoint of robbing nutrition and water from the adjoining plant that might be taller and healthier. So another current issue is we talk about gall midges. Soybean gall midge has become an issue in our area the last couple of years. Last year was kind of an off year. 2 years ago, gall midge was in high population. The problem with gall midges is that there's a lot of unknowns with it, not only in life cycle, how and when to treat with what, because there really isn't an insecticide that has a label for gall midge control, at least thorough control at least. So it all boils back down to documenting what kind of pressure you have, where it occurs in the field, and here's kind of what we know so far. Gall midges usually migrate in off the edges of the field, or maybe a grass terrace, or maybe a grass waterway, and typically they don't move all that far. Usually maybe 100, 120 feet out of their edges of the field is generally where they affect that crop. Last year, 2 years ago, there were abstract instances where it might have worked a little bit further in off the field. There's a little confusion as far as how many life cycles in it. We normally talk about maybe 2 or 3. Last year, there was maybe upwards of 4 to 5. So, you know, it's a little bit of an unknown thing. And the other thing that confuses folks is that gall midge injury looks like a lot of the Phytophthora or the Pythium diseases that are soil-borne that affect the soybean crop early. So what I did was I just kind of picked off a couple soybean plants, and you can see that what we're looking for gall midge infection is that if these stems are fractured or they've got fissures or cracks within the stem right at the soil line. These really don't, pretty healthy. The other thing is that the separation between gall midge injury and soil-borne diseases is typically again, the meristematic tissue within. This is all good, healthy, and white. And that's what you want to see. If you've got discoloration within that meristematic tissue, and then you get that pinching off right at the soil line, that's more of a soil-borne disease thing than a gall midge thing. But driving down the road, you see the plants turning brown, withering up, and dying. So our recommendation really right now is to scout, document. If you've got split stems and you can actually physically see them, which you've got to be pretty good crop scout to find that or see them, even below the canopy line, there's a very small window for application. Pyrethroid insecticides appear to have the most effect on gall midges, but you got to get the timing right before you got to get the timing. Once the adults are detected, they can be available for about 10 days before they cycle out and become the midge form of the insect, and then they burrow into the plant, and at that point they're generally unable to be affected by anything. So encourage folks to take a peek at their soybean fields along the edges, see if they have any of evidence of gall midge pressure. Burrow around, and then at that point you can determine whether or not you can think about a pyrethroid insection, or basically document for the next year to get a better game plan.